Here's the truth most people refuse to sit with. Your need for control isn't a strength. It's a wound with a strategy built around it. And in 2026, that strategy is more sophisticated, more socially acceptable, and more destructive than at any point in human history. Carl Jung saw this clearly a century ago, and everything he warned about is playing out in your daily life right now. In your relationships, your productivity systems, your anxiety, and in the quiet rage you feel when things don't go according to plan. Jung identified something inside every human psyche he called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything you've rejected, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge about yourself. The shadow isn't evil, it's simply unintegrated. And one of its most common, most hidden expressions is the compulsive need to control your environment, the people around you, and even your own emotional states. You don't experience it as fear, you experience it as responsibility, as standards, as knowing better. That distinction is where most people lose themselves entirely. The archetype operating underneath this pattern is what Jung called the controller, a psychological figure that emerges when the ego feels fundamentally unsafe in an unpredictable world. Understand this clearly: the controller doesn't arise from competence. It arises from a deep, pre-verbal terror of chaos. Somewhere in your psychological history, likely long before you had language to describe it, your system learned that if you could manage outcomes, you could manage pain. The psyche adapted, and what was once a survival mechanism calcified into a personality structure. This is where most people fail. They mistake the adaptation for identity. In 2026, the controller archetype has found perfect camouflage. Optimization culture rewards it. Productivity content glorifies it. Wellness frameworks dress it in the language of boundaries and self-discipline. So you're not just controlling, you're being praised for it. You're being followed on social media for it. The unconscious pattern is now culturally reinforced, which means the psyche never gets the signal that something is wrong. You think you're growing, but you're actually feeding your shadow. Here is what's happening beneath the surface. The unconscious mind operates on one primary currency: safety. When your nervous system registers uncertainty, an unanswered message, an unpredictable partner, a career path without a clear roadmap, the controller activates. It begins scanning for variables it can manage. It creates lists. It sets expectations. It monitors. It over-communicates. It rehearses conversations. It prepares for every outcome except the one it cannot tolerate: genuine surrender to the unknown. And because this activation feels productive, feels responsible, feels mature, you never question it. But Jung's framework makes the cost undeniable. Every unit of energy directed toward controlling external reality is energy withdrawn from your interior life. The more rigidly you manage your outer world, the more dissociated you become from your actual emotional experience. You stop feeling and start managing. You stop connecting and start directing. This is the psychological mechanism behind why high-control individuals often report a strange inner emptiness. They have optimized their aliveness away. The unconscious doesn't need you to stay broken. It just needs you to stay unaware. And the most uncomfortable truth Jung offered isn't about what you're controlling. It's about what the controlling protects. Beneath every control pattern is something that was never allowed to be vulnerable. Something that was shamed, dismissed, or threatened into silence. The controller is the armor. The wound is underneath, and until you turn toward the wound instead of managing around it, the armor becomes the prison. Let's go deeper, because this is where Jungian psychology stops being theoretical and starts being a mirror you cannot look away from. In 2026, the need for control expresses itself through systems that feel entirely rational. You batch your emotions into scheduled therapy sessions so they don't interrupt your week. You keep relationships at a precise emotional distance, close enough to feel connection, far enough that no one can genuinely destabilize you. You consume self-improvement content compulsively, not because you want to grow, but because learning about growth is safer than actually surrendering to it. The psyche is extraordinarily intelligent. It will use every tool available, including your most sophisticated habits, to avoid the one thing it fears most: genuine psychological exposure. Jung called this process of unconscious self-protection an antiodromia, the tendency of any extreme psychological position to eventually flip into its opposite. The person who controls most rigidly is always closest to collapse, not because life punishes control, but because the unconscious builds pressure in direct proportion to how forcefully you suppress it. You can manage your anxiety for months, even years, but the shadow accumulates, and when the collapse comes, it does not look like weakness. It looks like a sudden, inexplicable decision. A relationship ended without clear reason. A career abandoned overnight. A breakdown dressed as a breakthrough. That is the unconscious finally forcing what the ego refused to choose. This is the realization most people never reach. Your shadow doesn't oppose you. It completes you. The controller in your psyche exists because somewhere, buried under years of performed competence, there is a self that genuinely does not know what comes next, and is terrified by that. Integration doesn't mean eliminating the need for structure. It means developing an honest relationship with the fear underneath it. The moment you can sit with uncertainty without immediately reaching for a mechanism to resolve it, something fundamental shifts in your psychology. You stop managing your life and start inhabiting it. Look at your closest relationships in 2026. High-control individuals consistently create one of two dynamics. They attract people who are deeply passive, unconsciously relieved to have someone else manage reality, or they attract people who mirror their control back, creating cycles of power struggle that neither party fully understands. In both cases, genuine intimacy becomes impossible. Intimacy requires the tolerance of not knowing. It requires the willingness to be affected by another person in ways you cannot predict or pre-process. The controller archetype cannot allow this. So it substitutes management for connection and calls it love. Your professional life carries the same signature. In a world increasingly defined by AI systems, rapid career pivots, and structural instability, the control-driven psyche is experiencing a specific kind of crisis. The old contract, work hard enough, plan carefully enough, and outcomes remain predictable, is functionally dead. And for someone whose entire psychological architecture rests on the belief that control produces safety, this is not just inconvenient. It is existentially threatening. What emerges in response is either escalating rigidity or total shutdown. Both are shadow responses. Neither is integration. So what does integration actually require? Jung was precise about this. It begins with conscious confrontation, meaning you deliberately place yourself in contact with the thing your controlling behavior is designed to avoid. Not recklessly, not performatively, but honestly. You sit with the unanswered question without solving it that day. You stay in the uncomfortable conversation without redirecting it. You notice the moment your psyche reaches for control, and you pause in that moment long enough to ask, what am I actually afraid would happen if I didn't manage this? The answer that surfaces is the beginning of your shadow work. The second step is what Jung called active imagination, engaging the shadow not as an enemy to defeat, but as a part of yourself that has been trying to protect you. The controller believes, at the deepest level, that if it stops working, something devastating will occur. Your work is to examine that belief directly. Is it true? Has your control actually prevented pain, or has it only delayed it while ensuring you experienced it alone? The final realization is the one that permanently alters how you move through the world. Control is not the opposite of chaos. Presence is. The psyche that is genuinely integrated its shadow does not become passive or structureless. It becomes grounded. It can hold uncertainty without being destabilized by it. It can engage with unpredictability without immediately converting it into a problem to solve. That is not weakness. That is the psychological maturity Jung spent his entire career pointing toward. In 2026, in a world that is accelerating beyond anyone's ability to fully manage, the most radical thing you can do is stop trying to control your way to safety and start developing the interior capacity to remain whole when control is no longer possible. That capacity already exists inside you. It is buried beneath the armor, and it has been waiting.